I was partway along the path, feeling the weight of my pack press into my shoulders. Despite the discomfort, the view and the crisp fall air made it worth the effort. The forest was stunning that afternoon, with golden and rust-colored leaves carpeting the ground and the faint smell of wet soil lingering in the breeze. Not a soul was in sight, just the crunch of my boots against the scattered leaves. Around 40 minutes in, I realized how unnaturally quiet it had become. There were no chirping birds, no squirrels rustling through the underbrush, and not even a whisper of wind to stir the tree branches. It was as if the entire forest had fallen silent, like someone had turned off the sound. That sort of stillness doesn't happen naturally, not for long anyway. I brushed off the unease, telling myself I was just exhausted and imagining things. But as I walked further, an unsettling sensation crept in, a feeling that I wasn't by myself. Every so often, I'd glance over my shoulder, but all I saw were tree trunks and shifting shadows. The sun was dipping lower, casting stretched out, eerie shadows across the trail. I thought about heading back, but the ridge summit wasn't far now. I could catch glimpses of the open sky through the thinning canopy, marking where the path ended. Determined, I quickened my steps, eager to be done with this strange stretch of the woods. Then, from the corner of my vision, I caught something, just a flicker of movement among the trees. I stopped in my tracks, squinting into the distance, but whatever it was had vanished. I told myself it was likely a deer or some animal watching me, just as nervous as I felt. Still, it didn't sit right. Its motion had been too quick, too purposeful. I shook it off and pressed on, but the unease stuck with me. A few minutes later, I heard it, a faint crunch of leaves behind me. I froze, listening. When I stopped, the sound stopped too. I took a few tentative steps, moving slower this time, my ears straining. Then I heard it again, closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I picked up the pace. Not quite running, but certainly not walking casually either. It felt like something or someone was shadowing me, matching my steps while staying just out of sight. I tried to stay calm, reasoning that this was a public hiking trail. Maybe it was another hiker, someone I'd simply missed earlier. But deep down, I didn't believe it. And then I saw something else. Footprints. They weren't mine. These were fresh, large, and unmistakably human. They veered off the trail, leading into the dense woods. I glanced up at the dimming sky. The last slivers of daylight were fading quickly. I knew I needed to hurry, but the idea of whoever had made those tracks being nearby sent shivers down my spine. I forced myself to keep moving, resisting the urge to sprint, afraid that running might provoke whatever or whoever was out there to give chase. Finally, the outline of the trailhead came into view. Relief washed over me as I emerged from the forest and stepped into the open lot where my car was parked. I jogged the last stretch, fumbling with my keys before unlocking the car and sliding inside, slamming the door shut behind me. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, my heart still racing. Just as I was about to pull away, I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting someone or something to emerge. But there was nothing there, only the dark, silent woods. I drove home, the adrenaline slowly wearing off, leaving my muscles sore and tense. Even after returning, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That lingering unease clung to me, as persistent as the scent of damp earth from the trail. For days after, I scoured the news for anything odd about that area but found nothing. I still go hiking, but now I make sure never to venture onto the trails alone again. I've been hiking alone for years, and it's one of the few things that truly makes me feel alive. Just me, my gear, and the untamed trail ahead. When I heard about a secluded path in a remote mountain range far from any major road, I knew it was the escape I needed. It was described as a simple loop, roughly 13 miles. My plan was to finish it in a single day, so I set out early with only the essentials: water, a map, and a few extra layers. The first stretch was serene, the forest around me buzzing with life in the cool morning air. About 3 hours in, the trail began to narrow, barely visible beneath a blanket of fallen leaves. I wasn't concerned. My map indicated the path would clear up soon, so I pressed on. The sky above grew heavier with clouds, but the forecast promised no rain until evening, long after I planned to finish. Then I noticed it, the quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping birds, not even a whisper of wind. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. A chill crept down my spine, but I kept moving forward. Suddenly, a sharp pain shot through my foot. Looking down, I saw my ankle lodged in a hidden hole under the leaves. Pain radiated as I pulled it free, and it was already swelling. I sat down, trying to assess the damage. After a few moments, reality sank in. No one knew exactly where I was, and I hadn't seen another hiker all day. According to my map, I was about 7 miles in, too far to turn back. My only option was to push ahead and hope to complete the loop. Each step was agonizing as I hobbled forward, sweat dripping despite the cool air. My surroundings stayed eerily quiet. Hours passed, and then it began to rain. Not the light drizzle I'd expected later, but a torrential downpour that soaked me to the skin. The trail turned to mud, and every step became a battle to stay upright. My ankle throbbed, and the cold began to seep into my bones. At some point, I realized I had wandered off the trail entirely. The trees around me looked unfamiliar, and there were no markers in sight. Panic surged as I fumbled for my phone, only to find there was no signal. The afternoon light dimmed under thick clouds, making the forest feel darker than it was. Desperation drove me onward, limping through the woods, hoping for some sign of the path. Then, through the sheets of rain, I spotted a small clearing. In the middle stood a dilapidated wooden shelter, little more than a few walls and a roof. I stumbled toward it, grateful for any respite. Inside, I sank to the ground, out of the relentless rain at last. I stayed there for a while, calming my racing heart and waiting for the pain in my ankle to subside. As the rain eased, I spotted a faint trail leading away from the shelter. It wasn't the one I had come from, but it was a path. With no other choice, I followed it, each step excruciatingly slow. Hours later, the forest began to thin, and I finally glimpsed the parking lot in the distance. Relief washed over me as I limped toward my car, utterly spent but safe. That experience taught me to respect the wilderness. Now, I always share my plans with someone, double-check the weather, and avoid solo hikes whenever possible. It began as what was supposed to be a straightforward hike, just a few hours on a trail I'd heard mentioned by someone at the local store. The trailhead was hidden at the end of an old dirt road, the kind that only longtime residents seemed to know about. I checked the weather, packed a bottle of water, a granola bar, and threw a small flashlight in my backpack just to be safe. My phone had barely any reception, but I figured I'd be back well before sunset. The path was overgrown, with bushes and branches crowding close around me, but it had a tranquil charm. The sound of my boots crunching over twigs and dry leaves mingled with the distant murmur of a creek to my right. I felt utterly alone with my thoughts, relishing the stillness, as though I'd ventured far from the rest of the world. About an hour in, the trail grew steeper. I found myself stepping over fallen logs and crouching under branches that hung low like they were trying to block my way. It wasn't long before I realized something was off. The air felt heavier, the kind of quiet that wasn't just peaceful but unnatural. I glanced around and realized I hadn't spotted any markers for some time. Normally, even a remote trail like this would have some kind of signs. an arrow carved into a tree or a strip of faded paint. But there was nothing. I kept walking, convinced I'd spot something soon, but the trail began to twist and split in ways that didn't feel right. Each turn seemed to pull me deeper into the woods. I stopped, trying to calm the rising unease in my chest, and pulled out my phone. No signal. The growing realization that I might actually be lost sent a knot tightening in my stomach. I told myself to stay calm. Panicking wouldn't help. I turned back the way I thought I'd come, but it all looked the same. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks forming an unbroken wall of shadows. I tried to retrace my steps, but nothing seemed familiar. The sun was sinking fast, and with it came a chilling sense of dread. I switched on my flashlight as twilight gave way to darkness, hoping the battery would last. The beam cut a narrow path through the black, but the forest beyond felt endless, stretching out in all directions like some vast and alien place. Hours passed. Exhaustion crept in, and my legs grew heavy. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I caught a glimmer of something ahead, a faint flash reflecting in the light. I moved closer, my heart pounding, and saw a strip of reflective tape tied to a branch. Relief surged through me. It was a marker. Following it, I found another, then another. The markers led me back, guiding me out of the maze. When the trail finally opened into the small clearing where my car was parked, the sky above was pitch black, scattered with stars. I stumbled to the vehicle, nearly collapsing into the driver's seat. As I started the engine and drove down the winding road toward town, I kept glancing at the trees in my rearview mirror. The dense darkness seemed to press against the edges of the road, swallowing the path I'd just escaped. It was over, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided something. Not just being lost, but something more, something hidden in the ordinary stillness of that forest. It was meant to be a simple trek. I had been planning it for weeks, eager for some quiet time in the hills. The weather was perfect, my gear was carefully packed, and the path was supposed to be clearly marked. But after a few hours, I realized the trail wasn't as well defined as I'd expected. I kept moving forward, assuming the path would become clearer. Didn't. The farther I went, the more the trees seemed to press in around me, and the sunlight dimmed, even though it was still early afternoon. I pulled out my map, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Nothing matched the surroundings. The trail had narrowed, winding through dense thickets and overgrown bushes, until it was almost impossible to follow. Unease crept in as I realized I hadn't seen a single trail marker for over an hour. My phone had no service, and the battery was draining faster than I'd anticipated. I tried not to panic. Just retrace your steps, I told myself. I turned around, trying to follow my footprints where they were visible. But the forest looked identical in every direction, and soon even the faint traces of my footprints vanished. A sense of dread began to rise, but I forced myself to stay calm. I took a deep breath and decided to keep moving until I saw something familiar. Hours slipped by. The sun started to dip lower, casting long shadows that made everything look even more alien. I called out, hoping someone might hear me, but the only reply was the heavy, stifling silence of the forest. I quickened my pace, stumbling over roots and pushing through branches that scratched at my arms and face. Every noise, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the snap of twigs, seemed amplified in the deepening twilight. Just when I was ready to give up, I noticed it. A weathered marker hidden in the underbrush. It wasn't the type of trail sign I'd been looking for, but it felt like a glimmer of hope. I pushed aside branches to get a closer look and saw that it was an old hunting marker etched into a tree trunk, its edges worn smooth with time. The sight of it sparked a memory. I'd once read that hunters used markers like these to find their way back to main paths. Encouraged, I decided to follow it. My steps became more purposeful, and I tried to keep my breathing steady as the forest grew darker around me. After what felt like an eternity, I heard it, a faint, steady noise in the distance. I froze, holding my breath to listen. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, and consistent. It was the hum of traffic, the faint roar of vehicles on a road. Relief surged through me. I followed the sound, pushing forward even as my legs screamed in protest. Finally, after clambering down a steep incline, the trees thinned, and I emerged at the edge of a highway. The road gleamed faintly in the dim light. I stumbled onto it, gulping in the open air. A car passed, then another. I waved one down, and the driver stopped to help. As I sat in the car, thankful to be out of the woods, I glanced back at the dark line of trees. The driver mentioned how easy it was to lose your way on the unmarked trails nearby. I nodded, still processing the experience. That forest had confused and trapped me, but I had made it out. I was out trekking through the outskirts of a nature reserve I had read about online, a spot known for its scenic views and variety of trails. It wasn't a well-known location, which appealed to me because I figured it would be calm and serene. For the first hour, it was exactly that. Clear skies, crisp air, and nothing but the whisper of the wind in the trees accompanied me. I carried my phone with a navigation app to track my route, since I wasn't entirely familiar with the area. I had been sticking to a marked path, but somewhere along the way, I must have either missed a turn or gotten overconfident. The trail began to grow rough, and the signs marking the way became scarce. I dismissed it, figuring I could always retrace my steps if needed. However, as I ventured deeper, the landscape became harder to recognize, and I started to realize I wasn't entirely sure where I had come from. At some point, I noticed my phone's GPS was acting up. The little marker that showed my position kept jumping around, indicating I was near my starting point, even though I had been hiking for hours. Resetting the app didn't help. The marker continued to glitch, showing locations that didn't make sense. To conserve battery, I switched off my phone, hoping I'd find a better signal later. The sun was sinking behind the hills, casting long shadows over the forest, and I became aware that I was in a tricky situation. I didn't feel entirely lost, but unease was creeping in. I followed what looked like an old wildlife trail, assuming it might guide me back to the main path. The silence was unsettling. No birdsong, no rustling in the underbrush, just an oppressive, eerie stillness. As I tried to calm myself, I caught a faint noise, like footsteps echoing in the distance. Maybe it was an animal or another hiker, but something about the sound felt wrong. It was too consistent, too intentional. I stopped, hoping the sound would fade, but it didn't. It paused, just like I had, as though something or someone was listening, too. My heart thudded as I took a deep breath and began walking faster, scanning the area for any markers that might point me in the right direction. Then I spotted something. A small, tattered scrap of fabric snagged on a low branch. It seemed like it had been there a long time. Perhaps another traveler had left it behind while wandering off course. I picked it up, finding a strange sense of reassurance. It was proof I wasn't the only one who had struggled here. As I moved on, I started noticing faint signs. Broken twigs, faint footprints, some fresher than others. My thoughts kept returning to those strange, deliberate footsteps I'd heard earlier. Who had made those prints? Why were they here? The questions buzzed in my mind as I quickened my pace, eyes scanning the ground for any sign that could lead me out. Finally, I saw it, the trailhead in the distance. Relief surged through me, and I broke into a jog, feeling lighter with every step. But as I neared the start of the path, something caught my attention. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. A figure standing in the shadows, half obscured by the trees. I couldn't make out much, just the shape of someone still and watching. I didn't linger. Without looking back, I hurried to my car, got inside, and locked the doors. Sitting there, catching my breath, I felt a strange sense of calm. Whatever or whoever had been in the forest didn't follow me out. It was as if I had crossed an invisible barrier separating the mysteries of the woods from the safety of the outside world. I drove home that evening, grateful to return to familiar surroundings. Yet, every now and then, my thoughts wander back to that quiet, shadowy stretch of trail, the faded scrap of cloth, the footprints that led me out, and the figure I glimpsed just before leaving. I haven't returned to that trail since. I leave it to the silence and the shadows. Sometimes it's best to stick to the paths you know. The hike began just as I had envisioned. Just me, the trail, and the steady crunch of my boots on the cool morning path. The air was fresh, and the route was isolated, far removed from any main roads. I was eager for the quiet and the challenge of reaching a hidden lake I'd read about before making my way back before sunset. The first couple of hours were peaceful. The path was easy to follow, and I felt completely at ease, surrounded by the stillness of the forest. The atmosphere seemed almost too calm, but I brushed it off, attributing it to the early hour. About 6 miles in, though, things began to change. At first, it was the trail itself, becoming narrower, with the trees pressing in from both sides, limiting my visibility to just a few feet ahead. Then, there was the silence. Not the natural hush of the wilderness, but an unsettling, absolute stillness. No birds, no rustling leaves, not even the faint sound of insects. It was as if the forest had paused. Uneasy, I kept moving, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination. That's when the sensation hit. A cold, crawling feeling along the back of my neck, like unseen eyes were fixed on me. Every time I turned to look, there was nothing but shadows and dense undergrowth. Despite seeing nothing, the feeling wouldn't go away. I quickened my pace, focusing intently on the path ahead. A mile further, I stumbled upon a fork in the trail that wasn't marked on my map. One path was clearly the main trail, while the other was overgrown, looking as if it hadn't been traveled in years. Against my better judgment, I chose the rougher path, thinking it might be a shortcut. 20 minutes in, it was obvious that this wasn't a well-used trail. Branches snagged my clothing, and patches of dense brush obscured parts of the path. The eerie feeling had faded a bit, though, so I pressed on, convincing myself that I was on the right track. Then, I heard it, a faint rustling noise behind me. My heart jumped as I glanced back, but there was nothing there, just the forest. I told myself it must be an animal, though something about it felt deliberate. I kept moving, now at a quicker pace, the sound of my breathing growing heavier. A sudden snap, a branch breaking, stopped me in my tracks, came from just a few feet behind me. Slowly, I turned, expecting to see someone or something, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed darker, and the trees loomed closer. I decided I had to turn back. My sense of direction was failing, and whatever was out there felt too close for comfort. Retracing my steps was harder than I'd imagined. The twisted trail seemed unfamiliar, and every sound made me jump. That rustling noise returned, always just far enough away to stay out of sight. Finally, I stumbled back onto the main trail. Relief washed over me as I leaned against a tree, catching my breath. The silence was back, but whatever had been following me seemed to be gone. I wasted no time, moving as quickly as I could toward the parking lot. When my car came into view, I felt a surge of relief. Practically sprinting the last few yards, I threw my pack into the back seat and locked the doors. Driving away, I couldn't resist glancing into the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking at the edge of the woods. But there was nothing, just the stillness of the trees. Back home, I felt safe, but the experience haunted me. Something had been in those woods, something that didn't want me there. Now, when I hike alone, I stick to well-marked trails and always let someone know where I'm going. Some places, I've learned, are better left unexplored when you're by yourself. One weekend, I decided to go on a solo hike to clear my mind. I chose a trail I'd never explored before, one that was fairly remote but had positive reviews online. The weather was perfect, the sun was shining, the air was cool, and I felt ready for a calm day outdoors. I packed a few essentials, checked the map, and started out. First, the trail was stunning. It wound through thick evergreens and dipped near a small brook. But as I went further, things began to shift. The trees became more tangled, with branches snagging at my clothes as I passed. The ground was littered with fallen leaves and gnarled roots. The path became harder to follow, as if no one had been there for years. Eventually, I noticed I hadn't come across a single trail marker in quite some time. My gut told me I might have veered off the main path, but I convinced myself I could just retrace my steps if needed. Hoping to spot a familiar landmark, I pushed forward. The trail narrowed, resembling more of an animal path than something meant for hikers. As I kept going, a strange unease settled over me. An hour, maybe more, passed without anything looking familiar. The temperature dropped, and clouds began to gather, dimming the light. I tried not to let panic take over, but then I noticed something peculiar. Scattered branches on the ground. They looked deliberately arranged, with some twisted unnaturally and others marked with strange scratches. I dismissed it, thinking animals might have been responsible. Still, I couldn't shake the growing feeling of being watched. Now and then, faint rustling came from the bushes. It was too quiet to be a large animal, but loud enough to make me pause and listen. My heart raced, my palms damp with sweat. It felt as though something unseen was following me, staying just out of sight. When I tried to head back, nothing looked right. Every direction seemed unfamiliar. I was completely disoriented, and no matter which way I went, I couldn't find the original trail. The woods grew darker and denser, closing in around me. My phone had no service, of course, and I deeply regretted not telling anyone exactly where I'd gone. After what felt like hours, I spotted a break in the trees ahead. Relief surged through me, and I hurried toward it, hoping it was a clearing or some landmark I recognized. But as I approached, I realized it was an abandoned campsite. Rusty cans lay scattered around a fire pit filled with old ashes. A partially collapsed tent stood nearby, looking as though it hadn't been touched in years. An eerie feeling swept over me. Something about the sight felt deeply unsettling. I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. That's when I heard the rustling again, louder this time, coming from the direction I had just left. I couldn't see anything through the thick trees, but I was certain I wasn't alone. I took a steadying breath and forced myself to move calmly, away from the campsite. I moved slowly, trying to avoid making noise. The forest was nearly silent now, except for the sound of my own careful steps. I knew I had to find my way out before nightfall, so I focused on walking in a straight line, hoping it would lead me to a road or something familiar. Just when I thought I'd be trapped out there after dark, I stumbled upon a rocky slope. It led steeply downhill, and in the distance, I spotted a road. A wave of relief washed over me, and I carefully made my way down the hill, slipping on loose gravel but not caring. When I finally reached the road, I turned back for one last glance at the forest. In the fading light, I could barely make out the trail I had left behind. It felt like I had escaped something dangerous, something more than just being lost. I returned to my car, feeling as though I had left a piece of myself back in those woods. As I drove away, one thing was clear. I would never hike a new trail alone again. The first rays of sunlight filtered through the canopy as I stepped onto the forest path, my backpack securely strapped on. I'd been anticipating this hike for weeks, a chance to escape the city's constant clamor and immerse myself in the calm of the wilderness. The initial stretch was serene, filled with birds chirping and the gentle crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots. I felt invigorated and free. After a couple of hours, I came across a split in the trail. The left route seemed well worn, but the right one appeared quieter and less traveled. Something about it drew me in, promising solitude and perhaps a hidden gem away from the usual crowd. As I ventured further down the lesser-used path, the environment began to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches blocking out much of the sunlight. An unsettling feeling crept over me, but I dismissed it. I had a map and plenty of time to explore. About an hour later, the trail became faint, almost disappearing. I struggled to determine where I was headed. When I checked my phone, I realized there was no service. A wave of anxiety hit me, but I calmed myself with a deep breath and decided to press on. I could always turn back if needed. As I continued, strange noises began to fill the air, twigs snapping and bushes rustling. Each time I stopped to look around, I saw nothing. I told myself it must be small animals, but the sounds felt deliberate, too close. A heavy sense of being watched settled over me. I decided to retrace my steps, but the fork in the trail was nowhere to be found. Every tree looked identical, and the path I thought I had taken seemed to have vanished. I was lost. Panic threatened to overwhelm me, but I forced myself to focus. Pulling out my map, I tried to make sense of the tangled forest around me. Hours seemed to pass as I wandered aimlessly, my legs growing weary. The sun dipped lower, casting long, eerie shadows that flickered at the edge of my vision. The unsettling noises grew louder, nearer. My heart raced as I quickened my pace, stumbling over roots and rocks. Then, up ahead, I saw an opening in the trees, a clearing. Relief washed over me as I rushed toward it, hoping for a way out. In the center of the clearing stood a small cabin, weathered and surrounded by overgrown grass. Someone must live here, I thought, and approached cautiously. The door was slightly open. I called out, but no one answered. The place felt strange, as though it had been abandoned for years. Despite my unease, I stepped inside. The wooden floor creaked underfoot, and the air smelled damp and stale. Dust floated in the dim light, filtering through cracks in the walls. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the cabin. My heart jumped, but curiosity compelled me to investigate. I found a door leading to a dark room cluttered with old furniture covered in sheets. As I entered, the floor groaned beneath me. In one corner, I noticed a trapdoor, partially open. Peering inside, I was met with impenetrable darkness. Another crash sounded, louder this time, shaking the entire cabin. A surge of fear told me I needed to leave. As I turned to go, the sound of footsteps approached from behind. A chill shot through me. Without looking back, I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I ran into the woods, adrenaline driving me forward. Each step felt like a lifeline as I pushed through the dense trees. Finally, the forest began to thin, and I stumbled back onto the main trail. Seeing other hikers in the distance filled me with relief. I didn't stop until I reached my car, heart still racing. Even then, I thought I could hear faint footsteps behind me. I didn't dare look back, just grateful to be safe. I vowed never to stray from the main path again.